Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm putting out the first of many previews for classes in Shadowlands. I'll preface all of this with the usual disclaimer that beta stuff is subject to change, but I'm really happy with the way Monk is looking and playing in Shadowlands right now. I have an article on Wowhead named something like State of Brewmaster Monk in Shadowlands that I'm not exactly sure when it's coming out, but it probably will be out before this video is released. Anyways, it's aimed something like that, and it more or less serves as a written companion piece to this video. I started working on this video back all the way in early alpha, and I held off on completing it for a couple of reasons. The first was that I wanted to see how Monk evolved as everything became available, and we got closer to a final version. And I do think we're relatively close to a final version of Brewmaster Monk on the beta, aside from some, fairly game-breaking bugs. Also, I got coronavirus. It basically took 2.5, maybe 3 months away from me. Please stay safe and healthy. Because it's been a while since I've made any videos, I guess YouTube has added a chapters feature that lets you make it easier for viewers to skip around to sections of the video. I love that, and I'm gonna make use of it. There's a chapter in the middle of this video titled something like the most important section of this video. And I'm not telling you that you have to skip ahead to it, nor am I telling you to not skip ahead to it. I'm just saying it's there, and it's a special chapter. Alright, that's enough intro, let's get to Brewmaster Monk. Let's just start with the recent past. Since Brewmasters were redesigned in Legion, they've had some ups and downs, but it has mostly been ups. I found the design of Ironskin Brew and Purifying Brew a little boring, but it's very effective. Monks have been the best raid tanks for most of BFA, they're pretty good throughout Legion, and they're pretty well represented in high-level Mythic Plus. The bottom line is that they're good, and most players would agree that they've been the best overall tank throughout BFA. Just to give my thesis statement for the rest of the video, Monks were the best tank in BFA, and their toolkit is better in Shadowlands. So let's get down to the real nuts and bolts of class changes in Shadowlands, and let's start with what's being removed. Azerite bonuses and essences are obviously going away, which hurts Brewmaster numerically quite a bit, but not mechanically. You lose versatility from Conflict and Strife, and mastery from Training of Nijao. Maybe you lose a crit proc or some other passive stats from Azerite as well. It's a loss in power, but the mechanics remain basically the same. Crucible of Flame added a decent chunk of single target damage, but I really won't miss it either. Bye-bye to BFA. Also going away, a couple of talents that no one really uses, and Ironskin Brew. And with that, let's move on to what's being added. Shuffle is back, sort of. Basically, Ironskin Brew was turned into a passive, and Keg Smash, Blackout Kick, and Spinning Crane Kick all apply it for free. Also, Spinning Crane Kick is now back as part of the Brewmaster toolkit. It's a much better filler offensively than Tiger Palm at the same energy cost. It's a pretty nice upgrade to the Brewmaster rotation in AoE, and it makes the class's AoE damage feel a lot less anemic. I really love how Monk is playing in the Shadowlands because of it. I've enjoyed Monk more in Shadowlands Beta than I did in the betas for Legion or BFA. Next up, it's the big skill that everyone is super hyped for, Celestial Brew. It's Guard with a longer name, and it's amazing. Because it's a brew, its cooldown gets reduced by Keg Smash and Tiger Palm, so it's technically a lot stronger than Guard ever was. As the tooltip indicates, its absorb value gets increased based on how much damage you've purified recently, which adds an interplay between your defensive skills. And potentially it can charge up to be an absorb shield worth around 100% of your health pool. It's a huge addition back into Monk's toolkit that gives the class some much needed self-healing. Monks are the most self-sufficient they've been since before the Legion redesign now. On the subject of much needed cooldowns, Monk is going from 0 offensive cooldowns to 2. Invoke Nijao has been one of the best looking and most worthless talents in the tree, and thankfully it's just being turned into a baseline skill. He deals a relatively small amount of AoE damage, That is increased by your recently purified damage, much like the Celestial Brew interaction. He's also a defensive cooldown, as he takes 25% of your stagger damage. That's a bit of a weird interaction there. The defensive component of him takes away stagger damage from you that you could otherwise use to increase his damage. I think the right move on Blizzard's part would be to add the damage he pulls away from you into his damage, or just to buff his damage overall, but otherwise this is a pair of bonuses that are a little bit at odds with each other. Even if they don't make that change, it's still pretty nice. His damage is probably not high enough for his 3-minute cooldown, but everything counts, and he does also reduce your damage taken by a little chunk, maybe 15 to 20% total damage reduction against physical sources, which is not bad. Also, Touch of Death is back. It hits mobs with less health than you for your full health pool, sort of. It also clears a portion of your stagger based on the damage it deals, so that's something. It's not a huge defensive benefit, and it's not an immensely valuable offensive cooldown like a Paladin's Wings, but for a single keybind it adds a huge chunk of damage. This is one of the less exciting abilities to return, but still extra damage in execute phases is good. Being able to quickly kill off adds is good, I won't say no. And then last, and maybe not least, is Clash. I'm very surprised that this skill came back. I've been making fun of Clash for years. It's been gone since the end of Mists of Pandaria, which was about 6 years ago. That means that monks have been without Clash for about 3 times longer than they had it. Anyhow, it's half a charge and half a death grip, with all the problems that both of those skills have on their own combined into one. But it is yet another mobility skill for the most mobile tank in the game, so who's complaining? Not me. It is on the global cooldown, so I will complain about that. Come on, man. Really, I'm just amused that they brought it back. I absolutely do not think this is a skill that monks need at all, but I'll take it. It can't hurt. It's very funny to use it on mobs that can't be death gripped and charge halfway to them and then have to keep walking the rest of the way, but whatever. Alright, now let's move on to changes to the base skills. Blackout Strike is being renamed to Blackout Kick, and its cooldown has been increased from 3 seconds to 4. I don't really care about the name, although I will miss the cool twirling staff animation, and the cooldown increase is just a straight nerf. Expel Harm has been totally revamped. It's usable without any healing spheres active. It doesn't heal for much, maybe 5% of your health, but, you know, better than it was before. It will consume any active healing spheres and increase its healing value accordingly. It also has a 5-second cooldown. This is another great improvement amongst self-sufficiency. Even at its relatively low base value, it's still a useful self-healing tool, and I have to say I'm thrilled. Purifying Brew now only has 2 charges because it's not being shared with Iron Skin Brew. It still works the same as it has in BFA, aside from the new synergies with Celestial Brew and New Zhao, of course. What's a little weird is that its cooldown is unchanged. In BFA, you drink a brew about every 4 to 6 seconds throughout most fights. Roughly 70% of your brews are used on Iron Skin Brew, and the other 30% would go to Purifying Brew. This means you drink a Purifying Brew every 12 to 15 seconds in BFA. In Shadowlands, the brew cooldown is still basically the same, but you don't have anything other than Purifying Brew to use it on. That means you're using Purifying Brew, instead of every 12 to 15 seconds, about every 5 seconds. With the reduction in charges from 4 with talents in BFA down to 2 in Shadowlands, there's even less opportunity to pool up brews. This isn't a nerf. Pooling brews is largely useless when all you're going to use them on is Purifying Brew, but it does mean that you're going to be chugging a Purifying Brew basically every 5 seconds throughout all combat. It's not a bad thing, it's just weird, there's an adjustment period. And also you can move while channeling Zen meditation. Neat. Now let's move on to talents and just go row by row. The first row of talents is functionally identical to how they are on live servers, and I'm going to say that a couple of times here. I do think the offensive superiority of Spinning Crane Kick could lead to scenarios in which you wouldn't want to waste globals on Tiger Palm, and Chi Wave or Chi Burst could be theoretically useful. There is a problem with adding yet another keybind for a relatively minor skill to Brewmaster. You already have like 4 or 5 simple filler skills, you probably don't need more. There should be a difference between talents, especially ones that grant you abilities, but the damage and healing granted by this tier is just small enough that it doesn't really matter. The second tier is exactly the same as it is on live servers, and it really just boils down to whether you want the controlled mobility of Tiger's Lust or the simplicity of Chi Torpedo. Nothing new here, and that's fine. Tier 3, finally some new stuff. Spitfire is the same terrible talent as it is on live, let's just ignore that. The choice between light brewing and black ox brew is different, but still about like it is on live servers. Light brewing no longer grants extra charges of brews, which, because purifying brew is no longer competing with iron skin brew for charges, doesn't actually wind up being a problem. Black Ox Brew will hypothetically be better for taunt swapping encounters and situations in which you would want to pool up a bunch of defenses, but it has a serious issue. You really need to use it on cooldown to make it compete with light brewing in terms of the total amount of celestial brews you're going to get during a fight. Unfortunately, Black Ox Brew is mostly a defensive cooldown. Should you use defensive cooldowns immediately on cooldown? No, probably not. Because of that, I expect the value of light brewing being easier to use and more of an always active benefit is going to make it more appealing to most players, just like it has been in BFA. I would probably stick to light brewing initially and for Mythic Plus, but I would keep Black Ox Brew in the back of my mind for, particularly nasty raid encounters. The next tier is exactly like it is on live, which is totally fine. Same thing again in the next tier, although I do think the addition of Celestial Brew and the retooling of Expel Harm make Healing Elixir quite a bit weaker than it already is. And Dampen Harm will probably lose a little bit more of its appeal as a small, short-ish defensive cooldown, thanks to just how incredibly strong Celestial Brew is. In the next tier, we finally have our first of 2 new talents. But first, Special Delivery is indirectly being nerfed a little bit due to having fewer brews banked up at the start of encounters. Ultimately, I don't think it's going to be worth using, not really because of that, but just for the same reasons it's not useful on live servers. It has a tendency to miss, it's undertuned, and it makes the rotation feel empty. Rushing Jadewind is still there, and it's still fantastic. Between Keg Smash, Rushing Jadewind, Spinning Crane Kick, and even Breath of Fire, Monks can deal a pretty decent amount of AoE damage now for the first time since Warlords of Draenor. Monk AoE damage is looking very good and very consistent. Rushing Jadewind does now have an AoE target cap of 6 enemies, which is annoying and could potentially hold it back in some really large-scale AoE, but I think 95% of the time it's going to be the right choice. Last in the tier, the Legion artifact ability Exploding Keg is back. While it will provide a good burst of damage and a minor defensive cooldown, it's probably not going to be a better pick than Rushing Jadewind in most scenarios, at least in their current tuning. It does a little bit more damage than 2 full Rushing Jadewind casts, which is good burst, but over the course of a full minute, that's a substantial chunk of damage you're going to miss out on, and it makes the rotation feel pretty empty to not have Rushing Jadewind. Also, with AoE threat being more of a problem for tanks at this point in Shadowlands, Mythic Plus testing, Rushing Jadewind's always active damage source is just really nice for picking up constantly spawning ads or ads that are scattering around, and that's just not something you're going to get out of either of the other 2 talents in the tier. Additionally, on a defensive note, despite the way it's written, it does not actually force your enemies to miss 3 seconds of auto attacks. It forces them to do 1% damage with auto attacks for 3 seconds. This means it won't be useful for resetting necrotic stacks, and it won't be useful for cheesing boss mechanics such as stacking debuffs. So it's back, but unfortunately it's back in its post-nerf format, and it probably won't be worth using. Sorry. Finally, in the last tier we still have High Tolerance, which should keep on being the best option in this tier until it gets completely redesigned. 15% haste is just so strong during progression rating, and it's really good in Mythic Plus too. Celestial Flames is the other new talent, and it's really not good at all. 5% more damage reduction from Breath of Fire would not be bad. Upping Breath of Fire's debuff uptime from around 75% to 100% wouldn't be a huge deal, but it wouldn't be bad either. Unfortunately, the 30% proc rate means that Breath of Fire's debuff will only be worth the extra 5% damage reduction about 20 to 25% of the time. Additionally, it's bugged right now and it only gives 3% extra damage reduction even when it's active. Even if that bug were fixed, that's worth 1% more total damage reduction. That sucks. Even if you weren't giving up High Tolerance, that sucks. But wait, there's less. The Spinning Crane Kick applies Breath of Fire component, only works while the other proc is active. So bumping your Breath of Fire uptime from 75 to 100% is really the only appeal of this talent, and it doesn't even accomplish that meager goal. Finally, Blackout combo hasn't really been changed, but with Blackout Kick's cooldown going up by a second, there's another indirect nerf to a talent that's already not worth using on live servers. It's technically the best talent for brew recharge time if you combo every Keg Smash, so hypothetically it can be worth using defensively, but it's a more complicated rotation that deals less damage to improve defenses very slightly. It does synergize well with Black Ox Brew, so that is a potential talent setup, but I have doubts that it will be competitive. I have heard reports of some players using the Celestial Brew combo to pause stagger damage while Celestial Brew is active, allowing them to build a larger stagger so that they can then purify it and amplify their subsequent Celestial Brews. I see there being a sort of interesting gameplay loop there, but it seems a lot more complicated than just running High Tolerance, and I would need to see more testing of that particular playstyle before I'm convinced that it's better than just the incredible power and simplicity of High Tolerance. Rotationally, Monk hasn't changed much. The increase to Blackout Kick's cooldown means that Keg Smash should be the highest priority skill in your rotation both in single target and AoE, and I guess that's probably why they made that decision. The only thing that's noticeably different is that I think Spinning Crane Kick could virtually always replace Tiger Palm as your primary filler, even in single target, but only offensively. Tiger Palm is better defensively due to reducing the cooldown of Celestial Brew, and obviously you will still want to use it if you take Eye of the Tiger. But at this point I really hate Tiger Palm in BFA and Shadowlands. It's one of the weakest filler skills in the game. Other than that, the rotation is largely unchanged. You'll want to find GCDs into which you can fit Celestial Brew, and you'll need to choose between whether you want to use Tiger Palm and Spinning Crane Kick at points where you're using filler. But that is basically all that's changed. Alright, we've made it to the most important section of this video. We've covered everything that's changing for the base class, we're about to move on to all of the new Shadowlands features and bonuses, but first, I'm going to answer the 3 most important questions about Brewmaster Monk. Is it good? Is it fun? And how does it compare to other classes? Starting with is it good? Yes. The start of every expansion has the same problem for tanks. You lose a ton of stats, you lose a ton of health, and you lose a ton of armor. That really hurts your survival, and Brewmaster is always the tank that gets hit the hardest. Just to give some context, warriors drop from 60% armor down to 35%, monks drop from 40% armor down to 13%. On top of that, your stagger value also drops from the mid-80s to the low 60s. All that being said, the return of Guard and Expel Harm as self-healing tools cannot be overstated. This is the thesis statement of the whole video, so if you hear nothing else, hear this. Monk was great in BFA, it is better in Shadowlands. But is it fun? Yes. I guess that's technically a matter of opinion. But yes, it is. Celestial Brew being on the GCD is not fun. It sucks. Other than that, the class is undeniably more fun. Spinning Crane Kick alone is enough to liven up the rotation and make the class play better. but the Covenant abilities also really add a ton of depth and strength, and the Return to the Best Legion legendary effect is very, very nice. I am already excited for the moment when I unlock that. And finally, how does it compare to other classes? By which I really just mean, how does it compare to Paladin and DK? This is a section of the video about which I'm going to have the least amount of certainty, both because balance and opinions can change, and I think it does depend on the tanking situation. There's just no question that DK is going to be better, probably than every other tank, but certainly better than Monk when it comes to tanking pure spell damage, regardless of whether removing magic stagger from monks is intended or a bug. DKs have more self-healing and about a 25% larger health pool. That adds up pretty quickly. Paladin has Divine Shield, Blessings of Protection, and Spell Warding, and all the interrupts in the universe thanks to Avenger's Shield. So what does Monk have that they don't? A lot. Number 1, monks have Stagger. There's some uncertainty as to whether magic stagger is intended to be removed or if it's just a bug, but either way, just having physical stagger is immensely powerful. On top of stagger, monks have mobility, they have AoE damage, and a huge self-shield on a short cooldown. I think Monk is an incredibly safe and smart bet as the best tank to start out the expansion. But really any of these 3 classes could be the number 1. I don't want to spoil upcoming videos, but I kinda do think it might just be DK due to their huge health pool, Death Strike, and their effective but a little boring defensive toolkit. It's a boring class, but it's good, man. Monk is definitely the more fun pick, and it's what I intend to focus on first. Alright, let's get on to one of the main Shadowlands features, Covenant abilities. Depending on which of the 4 Covenants you choose, you'll gain access to 2 abilities. The first is the Signature ability. It's a utility skill that applies to everyone who chooses the Covenant regardless of their class. The other is a class-specific skill for everyone who chooses a given Covenant. The class-specific skills have different secondary effects based on your spec, but my understanding of the Windwalker effects is that they are all pretty disappointing, so I'm just going to focus on Brewmaster. Let's start with the Kyrian Covenant. Their signature ability is Summon Steward. You summon a friendly little non-combat minion who gives you a reusable health pot that removes curses, diseases, poisons, and bleeds. Your steward can also function as a vendor or a respec tome. He's a pretty helpful little guy. The bleed removal potion will be useful during the first raid tier, but unfortunately it's on the same cooldown as health potions crafted by alchemy, and they provide a lot more healing, at least early in the expansion. As a result, it won't be a great health pot, just more of a utility option. The Monk ability is Weapons of Order, which grants 15% mastery, resets the cooldown of Keg Smash, and causes it to apply a stacking debuff that increases all of your damage to the target by 5%, up to 5 stacks. With a duration of 30 seconds and a cooldown of 2 minutes, that's around 25% uptime on a pretty strong offensive and defensive cooldown, and I really like it. The lone downside is that the debuff only lasts for 8 seconds, which is the same as the base cooldown of Keg Smash, so unless you have enough haste to get it all the way down to a 6-second cooldown, you're only going to have a 1-second window to restack the debuff before it falls off. So if you get stunned, or knocked back, or the enemy charges out of melee range, there's a potential chance where the debuff could fall off, which would cause this skill to lose a lot of power. I think the proper fix is just to increase the debuff's duration out to 10 or even 12 seconds. I've already given that feedback to Blizzard, but I would encourage you to do the same. Next is the Night Fae, and their signature skill is Soul Shape, which gives you a short, modest speed boost that you can reactivate to blink forward 15 yards. It looks great, but really, monks generally don't need extra mobility. Also, Soul Shape will end early if you use offensive abilities. It's not worthless, you can use it to blink over dangerous ground effects, but it's not great. The Monk ability is Feline Stomp, and while I initially thought it sucked, I've really come around. First off, it looks amazing. It's one of the best looking skills I've ever seen. It deals about twice as much damage as a Breath of Fire, which is still less than a single Keg Smash or a single Rushing Jade Wind cast. Basically, it's a filler skill. It applies Breath of Fire, which is fine, but not really an enormous bonus, and it has a chance to reset if you're fighting on it, which means you get more and more access to a glorified filler skill. Initially, my analysis stopped right there, which is why I really didn't love it. I mean, that's not horrendous, I can see the value in improving your filler damage, but it would feel like the weakest Covenant ability and a bit of keyboard clutter. There are a few things that I hadn't considered. First, a constant increase to the value of Monk's admittedly pathetic filler damage is actually pretty substantial, more than I was giving it credit for. It's not a big sexy cooldown, but the damage adds up a lot faster than you would think. My testing experience had it around 15 to 20% of my damage in a 3-target cleave scenario, which is very nice. It doesn't end there, and that's where soulbinds come into play. Soulbinds are a Covenant talent tree system that's big and complicated enough to deserve its own video, but I'll just drop this relevant bonus in here. Way of the Fae. It's a soulbind conduit that dramatically increases the damage of Feline Stomp, easily pushing it ahead of every skill in AoE. Night Fae is by far the best offensive option. Its defensive value is pretty limited, but there's really only one extremely defensive focused option available to Brewmaster Monks, and I'll get to that in a bit. Before that, it's the Venthyr. Their signature ability is Door of Shadows, which is a ground targeted teleport. Initially, it didn't require a path to the teleport destination, which would have made it really useful for people who love to climb or just be cheesy, but that power has been removed. This could be incredibly powerful for teleporting around trash packs in Mythic Plus, but because it has a cast time, I don't really see it as worth using overall when you're in combat. Mobility just isn't a problem for monks, so this isn't that appealing of a bonus. It's not bad, but not really screaming, pick me either. The monk class ability is Fallen Order, which has a complicated tooltip, but basically it works like this. It summons adds. The adds do damage. The amount of damage that they do is better than I expected. Still, this offers zero mechanical interaction. It's a cooldown you pop along with New Zao, but it doesn't have any of the defensive benefits or utility. Also, thematically, it makes no sense. A mirror that summons ghostly monks? Maybe Blizzard will buff its damage to the point that it's the #1 option, but until that happens, I won't be using it or recommending that anyone else use it either. It sucks. Finally, we have the Necrolords. They're another Covenant that I initially found underwhelming. Their Covenant ability is Fleshcraft, and it's a 4-second channel that isn't interrupted by damage. It grants you a shield worth 20% of your health pool, although that can go up to 50% if you're standing over the corpse of an elite. I don't like this all that much. It's fine, make no mistake, but I really don't like the idea of stopping to channel, ever. After killing a pack in a mythic dungeon before you move on to pull the next one, this could be a decent little bonus. Starting off combat with a big absorb shield can save your healer a little mana, but once it gets eaten up, then what? It's not going to last all that long. It's not a defensive cooldown, it's not a useful reactive heal, it's not practical to channel mid-combat, it's not even an occasionally useful little short-range teleport. It's just a shield for starting combat. I think this will look better to tanks than it actually is, and wind up being a much better option for DPS specs. I think that's especially true when you consider all the shielding you're going to get out of Celestial Brew. Finally, the Necrolord Monk skill is Bone Dust Brew, which you have to throw at your enemies. It gives all of your abilities a 15% chance to proc for 25% more damage or healing, which adds up to a grand total of 3.75% more damage while it's active. Not good. Because it's a brew, its cooldown is reduced by Keg Smash and Tiger Palm, and it also causes them to take an extra second off of your brew cooldowns. So the uptime on it is better than you might expect, somewhere in the ballpark of 30%. It only adds 1 extra second of brew recharge to each Keg Smash cast, regardless of whether you hit 1 enemy or 20, so don't expect it to instantly reset its cooldown. Offensively, that means it's still pretty bad, maybe a 1.1% total damage increase. But defensively, it can take a good bit more time off the average cooldown of Celestial Brew and Black Ox Brew, which is actually very good. Additionally, there's a Soulbind conduit that reduces Bone Dust Brew's cooldown even further, Bone Marrow Hops. Between Rushing Jadewind and Breath of Fire, and obviously Keg Smash, you should get plenty of procs while Bone Dust Brew is active, especially in AoE. I don't think this is the must-have covenant for most players, but I do think it's the right choice for someone who's using an extremely defensive approach. I could see it being popular in the World First race, maybe, and more likely the MDI and high-level Mythic Plus pushing. So just to give letter grades to all of the covenants, I would go A- for Kyrian, A- for Night Fae, B for Necrolords, and F+ for Venthyr. Now just in case you thought there weren't enough systems in Shadowlands, they're also reintroducing Legion legendaries, but with targeted crafting. Basically they've admitted, at least passively, that they were totally wrong about why legendaries needed to be RNG in Legion, and all I have to say to that is good. Again, this whole system deserves a video of its own. But here's the quick version. You unlock legendary powers, somehow. You gather mats to craft them by doing Torghast and using professions. Then you go into a special scenario where you craft a piece of armor that has a legendary power on it and your chosen secondary stats, and now you have a legendary. So let's start with the best and most popular Legion legendary bonus, and the only one you're going to need for Shadowlands, Storm Stout's Last Gasp. It increases the damage of Keg Smash by 30% and grants an additional charge of Keg Smash. It's a huge damage increase, it totally changes the way you approach your rotation, adding complexity and depth, and thanks to Celestial Brew, a good bit of defensive value. It rocks and you absolutely can skip the rest of the legendaries, but I unfortunately cannot. I have to read off the rest of this crap, so here goes. Facepalm, the former artifact trait, is back as a Brewmaster legendary. It grants a 10% chance for Tiger Palm to deal triple damage and take 1 second off the brew cooldown. This was a great trait back in Legion when you could get 7 ranks of it, which brought it all the way up to 70%, and combined it with Blackout combo, which used to triple the damage of Tiger Palm. Now that Blackout kicks on a longer cooldown, this sucks. 10% is a lot less than 70%. I'm not rating all the legendary effects, but this one's special. 0 out of 10. Whoever made this legendary just has no idea why the original trait was good. It required 2 different legendaries to use correctly, and the Blackout combo interaction that made it worthwhile was nerfed 50% with BFA. I feel bad that this exists, because I just feel bad for any player who accidentally makes this thing. It's abysmal. Mighty Pour, based on the BFA Azerite trait Straight No Chaser, makes Celestial Brew grant 15% more armor for 7 seconds. On a pre-made character, this adds up to almost 1.5% more damage reduction. It will scale differently depending on your gear and the content you're doing, but still terrible. The chance for Purifying Brew to not consume a charge is fine, but given that your Purifying Brew usage rate is up 300% from BFA, an extra 15% on top of that isn't going to be some huge bonus. This just doesn't feel very legendary. Flaming Kicks is a totally new power and it's very cute. Breath of Fire causes Blackout Kick and Spinning Crane Kick to deal 30% extra damage as fire, and refresh Breath of Fire. It's really not very good. The extra damage is fine, but Breath of Fire uptime is already around 75% baseline. Whatever devs have been working on Brewmaster thus far in Shadowlands keep overrating the value of Breath of Fire, and I have absolutely no idea why. It barely does damage, it grants 5 whole % worth of damage reduction, it's not a good skill. Why do they love it so much? This legendary is bad. Fatal Touch is a new all-purpose monk legendary. It takes 1 minute off the cooldown of Touch of Death. It's not worthless, but it's pretty boring, and there are always going to be better options, especially considering in most raid fights you're probably only going to get to use Touch of Death once anyways. Invoker's Delight grants 12% haste for 15 seconds after you invoke Nuzhao the Black Ox. This bonus is crap. It's weak, it's on a long cooldown, and it's not even up the entire time Nuzhao is active. And finally, Rollout grants 1 extra roll charge. They clearly ran out of ideas before they got to this point, and I've lost the will to even make fun of the item here or the person responsible. This just makes me feel bad. So legendary recap, Keg Smash shoulders and gloves are amazing, 10 out of 10, and literally the entire rest of the options are 0 stars, no, bad, and awful, and that may sound like I'm complaining, but I'm not. I love the Keg Smash shoulders. They're great. Not having to make any of these other awful options is totally fine. It means you can pick up Windwalker stuff and work on other characters sooner. Great. Alright, before we finish up, it's important to cover bugs. Now, bugs are a normal part of any beta, and I'm not doing this to complain about them. I'm really not. Brewmasters have an unusually large collection of bugs, and some of them may represent deliberate changes that could have substantial impact on balance. So are they intended changes, or just bugs? We just don't know. We've reported them to Blizzard and asked for clarification, but most of these bugs have been in since the very beginning of Alpha, and there haven't been any fixes or responses from Blizzard just to clarify one way or the other. Alright, let's cover the list. Dual wielding has not yet been implemented for Brewmasters. Yeah, technically monks are supposed to be able to use two-handers or dual wielding regardless of their spec, but that's not in yet. It'll be good for switching between Brewmaster and Windwalker, but it's not like it's an important skill or anything. Just makes gearing a little bit less annoying. Stagger doesn't apply to magic damage. You stagger 0% of all spell damage, meaning that if you take spell damage while staggering physical damage, the stagger will add 0% of the damage, which is none, and refresh the duration to 13 seconds. If removing magic stagger is intended, it's a humongous nerf and will need to be compensated for elsewhere by either increasing Brewmaster's pathetic tiny little base health pools or giving back magic stagger as a talent somewhere. Blackout Kick doesn't grant mastery stacks, despite mastery saying that it does. This is probably just a bug caused by changing the name from Blackout Strike to Blackout Kick. It would represent a pretty big increase in damage taken and make mastery a totally passive stat that's a good bit weaker if it is intended. Provoke doesn't grant a speed increase. Technically, the debuff says it's increasing the target's movement speed by 0%, and that's true. This is probably the best non-throughput utility that Brewmaster Monks have, and I would be extremely upset to see it removed. More classes should have the ability to taunt sprint enemies, not less. All 4 Covenant abilities are bugged. 2 of them straight up don't work. Weapons of Order grants 2 stacks of its debuff with each Keg Smash, which massively inflates its value. Hitting 5 stacks takes 7 seconds with the Keg Smash Legendary, as opposed to the 21 seconds it would take without the bug. That's a huge difference and makes it look a lot better than it will actually be. Fallen Order monks don't function correctly. The Brewmaster NPCs cast both Keg Smash and Breath of Fire, but only Keg Smash debuffs enemies. Feline Stomp cannot hit an enemy more than once per session of play. You have to log out of the game to hit an enemy with Feline Stomp a second time. This includes applying the Breath of Fire debuff. This is by far the weirdest bug I've ever seen. Bone Dust Brew's damaging proc does not work. It cannot proc damage. Bone Dust Brew's healing proc does work, but it will also grant a bugged version of the Mistweaver effect. If you cast Vivify on a Bone Dust Brew drenched target, it will heal all targets affected by Bone Dust Brew. This makes Brewmasters the best raid healing spec in the game while Bone Dust Brew is active. Touch of Death's activation window is extremely buggy. You can't cast it on targets that are at full health even if they have less health than you. If Touch of Death is usable on a target before they reach 35% health, hitting 35% will cause it to deactivate until they drop below 35%. Its damage also does not account for the Brewmaster passive health increase, meaning it's usable against targets that have less health than your Brewmaster health value, but it will only hit them for your Windwalker health value. On my copied over main character at level 50, that's a difference of being able to use it at 34,000 health, but it only dealt about 24,000 damage. Well, we're almost wrapped up here. I've played more Monk than any other tank on the beta, and I've really been impressed thus far. Covenant abilities can offer huge offensive power, additional offensive cooldowns, or a substantial amount of brew recharge. Guard and Spinning Crane Kick have made a welcome return. The Keg Smash shoulders coming back is another really nice benefit to get back as well. The class just feels better offensively and defensively than it has in BFA. The future is bright. I can't wait to be dead. I only have a few complaints about Brewmaster at this point, and the first I've already mentioned, the bugs and possibly removed abilities. We'll just have to see about those. The issue I haven't yet mentioned, and I'll close on, is this. Brewmaster has too many abilities in Shadowlands. In BFA, Brewmasters have 7 total throughput skills on the GCD, and one of them is Expel Harm, which doesn't actually add any healing of its own and isn't a high priority skill. In Shadowlands, you lose Crucible of Flames and gain Celestial Brew, Spinning Crane Kick, Invoke Najal, and Touch of Death, and potentially Phalanx Stomp, Bone Dust Brew, or Weapons of Order, all of which are on the GCD. Expel Harm also becomes a more commonly used skill. You've gone from 7 rotational on GCD skills to 11. This doesn't even include active skill talents such as Chi Wave or Chi Burst, or War Mode skills, or Clash. The concern here is that beyond simply needing to find more keybinds and grow more fingers, is that Brewmaster Monk has historically been defined as a simple but powerful class. This sudden explosion of skills threatens to make it one of the most complicated. A lot of these new skills are just filler, and there's no reason that some of the abilities with overlapping uses such as Rushing Jadewind and Spinning Crane Kick, or Breath of Fire and Phalanx Stomp shouldn't just be merged together. Right now the ability design outside of Keg Smash is filled with a lot of redundant skills. The ones I just mentioned really aren't that different from each other mechanically, only in the way they consume resources or their cooldowns function. Forcing players to devote a dozen keybinds to a bunch of different flavors of low damage, low defensive value filler skills makes the class feel cluttered and complicated, but not for any real reason. So that's my one complaint. I'm still enjoying Brewmaster very much, even if that great big speech made it seem like I'm not. I am. It's great. It just might wind up being more complicated than it is now. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Brewmaster Monks and Shadowlands, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands content, and thanks for watching. Bye.